Sarah and Walter met at one of the conferences dedicated to the development and implementation of innovative technologies in various areas of business. The young people felt a strong mutual attraction from the very moment they met. Sarah was already a wealthy heiress at the time, as her parents had died in a terrible car accident 2 years earlier. And Walter Harris was a cunning and far-sighted young man who immediately saw the potential benefit of such a relationship and therefore did his best to charm the modest Sarah. Their romance lasted about 6 months, after which they held a huge wedding, which surprised even the wealthiest residents of the city. At first, life with Walter felt like a fairy tale. The charming young man did everything to make his wife feel loved and desired. Bouquets of roses, gifts, and breakfast in bed literally drove Sarah crazy, filling her life with joy and meaning. But time passed, and little by little, Walter's feelings faded away. Of course, this didn't happen overnight. Walter's indifference deepened as Sarah filled him in on the details of the family business. Getting access to great opportunities, the man quickly felt rich and privileged, believing that the whole world should revolve around him. Many of Sarah's acquaintances told her that Walter only married her for money, but the naive young woman preferred not to pay attention to what seemed obvious to everyone else. In the 5 years of their marriage, the couple never managed to get pregnant, which had an extremely negative effect on their relationship. Deep down, Sarah felt guilty about it, and so she tried to make it up to her husband in every possible way. Walter, on the other hand, got increasingly used to the role of the rich man who could do anything he wanted. Meanwhile, the man completely disregarded the fact that he owed everything he had to his wife, whose parents left her an impressive inheritance. At some point, Walter got so carried away by playing the multi-millionaire that he even started having an affair. Peggy Wallace was an assistant at the firm that used to belong to Sarah's father. A spectacular blonde with an appearance worthy of the cover of a men's magazine immediately attracted Walter's attention, and a week after they met, they were already sleeping together. Ever since then, the lovers started seeing each other almost daily. Of course, this couldn't go on unnoticed by Sarah, who started finding long hairs and lipstick stains on her husband's things. However, Sarah was afraid to ask her husband about it directly, preferring to continue naively believing in his excuses. Meanwhile, his secret passion, Peggy, wasn't satisfied with the supporting role assigned to her by her cunning boyfriend. "Darling, I don't want to be someone's mistress until the end of my days. I need stability and confidence in the future," Peggy said, pursing her lips. At moments like these, Walter was ready to sink into the ground from his inability to take control of his own life. The fact was that he was still dependent on Sarah, who owned all the financial assets of her late parents. Now, if I were to get rid of Sarah, I'd become the sole owner of her fortune, Walter whispered, frightened by his own revelation. But the idea that all of his problems could be solved this way had already firmly settled in his mind. One day, tired of the constant fighting, Walter impulsively shared his idea with Peggy. "So what's the matter, dear? Help your wife pass to the afterlife and live happily ever after. I mean, I'm not saying it will be easy, but the prize you'll get for it makes it definitely worth the risk," Peggy said with a coquettish smile. The woman felt her lover's mood and immediately decided to use it to her own advantage. More than anything in this world, Peggy wanted to be the wife of a wealthy man who would surround her in luxury and wealth. Walter hesitated for several days before deciding on the plan that Peggy came up with. However, in order to implement it, he needed to lie to Sarah and lure her into a trap. To do this, Walter started a conversation about how nice it would be for them to have a picnic in the woods. "You have to agree. After all, having lived in Florida for so many years, we have almost never done anything out in nature. Let's take a camera and take some amazing pictures of the beautiful landscapes. It will be so romantic. And it will be a good opportunity for us to revive our feelings and discuss our relationship," Walter suggested with a simple smile. Having heard her husband out, Sarah couldn't help but start smiling. This was partly due to the fact that the woman really wanted to spend some time out in the fresh air, and partly because she had great news to share with her husband. "Of course, dear, let's do it. It'll be wonderful," Sarah responded and hugged her husband. Having gotten the approval of his naive wife, Walter started to implement his risky plan. Walter chose the most remote and swampy part of the forest in advance, and it was there that he intended to take his wife. On the day of the picnic, Walter and Sarah drove out of town in Walter's Chevrolet, leaving the car in a clearing hidden from human eyes. The man took his wife on a barely noticeable path leading deep into the forest, like an experienced guide. "Walter, are you sure that we need to go so deep into the forest?" Sarah asked worriedly. "Of course, dear. Trust me, I've explored this area carefully before taking you here," Walter hastened to reassure his wife. Unfortunately, the unsuspecting Sarah took her husband's words at face value and obediently followed him into the forest. The farther they went, the more impassable the terrain became, which justified the reputation of the South of the United States, famous for its swamps. At some point, Walter deliberately slowed down and let his wife go ahead. But before Sarah had time to take a couple of steps, her legs were ankle-deep in a swampy mess. "Oh, Walter, what's this? It looks like I'm stuck in the swamp," Sarah exclaimed in fright and turned around. But when the woman looked into the eyes of her husband, she saw only cold indifference there. Meanwhile, her legs were bogged down in the foul-smelling slush up to her knees. "What are you? Aren't you going to help me?" Sarah exclaimed with tears in her eyes. Walter only grinned and shook his head in response. "That's the place for you," the man said and took a few steps back. "Why, Walter? Why are you so cruel to me?" Sarah kept repeating, unable to stop crying. "Because you owe all of your fortune to your parents. After all, it was them who left you all your money, and all I got from my father was mountains of debt and an old house on the outskirts of the city. But I deserve to be rich no less than you do," Walter replied angrily. Then he looked around like a hunted wolf and walked away, ignoring the cries of his wife. "Oh God, what am I supposed to do now? I can't believe I was about to tell that monster that I'm pregnant," Sarah thought, plunging deeper into the quagmire. Bitter tears were flowing down her cheeks. The poor woman couldn't stop thinking that 2 lives would be lost in this swamp deep in the woods. Floundering desperately, Sarah was well aware that she wouldn't be able to get out on her own. And when the mud had already passed the level of her chest and almost reached her throat, the woman suddenly felt dizzy and lost consciousness. Being in a semi-conscious state, Sarah felt an incredible lightness and a feeling of flight caused by a sharp pull. "I probably died already," the woman thought, closing her eyes. But when Sarah opened her eyes again, she saw that she wasn't actually hovering in the air, but she was resting in the hands of a man dressed in a camouflage uniform. His courageous, strong-willed face was covered in barely noticeable wrinkles under his eyes and a short, well-groomed beard. "Who are you, and how did you get here?" Sarah whispered softly. "You shouldn't talk, miss. You need to save your strength," the stranger said in a pleasant voice and quickened his pace. Being carried by this forest giant, Sarah immediately calmed down and closed her eyes. The next time the woman woke up, she was already in a small town. She could smell herbs and something else, something that vaguely resembled the mixture of vanilla and pine needles. "I'm glad you woke up, miss," said the owner of the house, smiling hospitably. To Sarah's surprise, he wasn't actually a forest giant, but a tall man of about 30 with sparks in his eyes and a very pleasant voice. As it turned out a little later, Sarah Xavier's name was Brandon Gray. He was a lonely widower who lost his wife and son in a plane crash 5 years ago. But the most surprising thing was that after the death of his loved ones, Brandon built a small house in the wilderness and started living there with his cat, Spike. Having brought Sarah some tea, the man took her to the bathroom so that she could clean herself up. Then Brandon listened to her story and thought about it. The cruelty with which Sarah's husband tried to get rid of her didn't fit in the man's head. Looking at the woman trembling with fear and from the stress she experienced, Brandon felt a surge of inexplicable sympathy. This was also partly explained by the fact that Sarah looked very much like his late wife. "I hope you won't just leave it like that and will find a way to punish your husband?" Brandon asked cautiously. Sarah shrugged her shoulders in response and lowered her eyes, not knowing what to say. The point was that the woman had no idea what she needed to do next. Having survived her husband's attempt to kill her, she was well aware that she didn't have any evidence to prove what her husband tried to do to her, and it was unlikely that the police would just take her word for it. "I think I can help you with that, Sarah," Brandon said with a sigh. Sarah raised her eyes in surprise and looked at her savior. Brandon smiled and, with the look of a circus magician, announced that he had recorded the entire scene by the swamp on his phone camera. As it turned out, that fateful morning, the man went on his usual walk in the woods and became an accidental witness to the drama that unfolded there. Choosing not to reveal his presence, the man simply recorded everything that was happening, and after Walter left, he rushed to help Sarah out of the swamp. "With this kind of evidence, your husband definitely won't get away with what he did," Brandon added and confidently touched the woman's head. At that moment, tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but they were tears of joy and gratitude, and not sadness. Walter was detained that same day, thanks to Brandon's testimony and the recording from his phone. Under the pressure of irrefutable evidence, Walter quickly confessed and gave up his accomplice. Unfortunately, it was impossible to start a criminal case against Walter's mistress, so Peggy escaped with just a slight fright. But Walter was now facing a long sentence in the most secure prison in the state. After the incident in the woods, Brandon and Sarah stayed in touch, and 6 months later, they got married. Brandon Grace accepted the fact of Sarah's pregnancy as a true gentleman and treated her with understanding and love. Tired of being lonely, the man was happy to get a new family and was willing to raise Sarah's unborn child as his own. Meanwhile, Walter only got to learn about Sarah's pregnancy from the prison guard, who wanted to surprise him and told him the exciting news. Looking sadly at the barred window, the man covered his eyes with his hands and started crying. Unfortunately, tears didn't bring Walter any relief, but only aggravated his depression. Meanwhile, after all the hardships Sarah and Brandon faced in their lives, they were finally rewarded by fate and were living a happy family life, enjoying each other's company and raising their kiddo together.